He held a sawed-off shotgun in one hand and an ice cream scoop in the other. He was never supposed to be the hero. In the original script, he wasn't even supposed to survive the first movie. But somewhere between take one and the final cut, a balding, mustached ice cream truck driver named Reggie became one of the most beloved final girls, final guys in horror history. Not because he was the strongest, or the smartest, or the best-looking action star Hollywood could buy. Because he felt like one of us. Like your uncle who somehow ended up fighting evil dimensional dwarves and a 7-foot embalmer from another galaxy and just rolled with it. This week, the horror world lost that man. Reggie Bannister, actor, musician, Vietnam veteran, and by every account of everyone who ever met him, one of the kindest human beings the genre has ever produced, passed away at 80 years old. And before we get into how and why this loss is hitting the horror community so hard, I want you to understand something. This isn't just an obituary. This is the story of a guy who almost didn't become an actor at all, who spent decades being told his career had a ceiling, and who ended up starring in 5 films across nearly 4 decades, a run almost no actor in genre film history can claim. Stick around, because by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly why Don Coscarelli, the man who created Phantasm, called him his hero. Let's talk about Reggie. Before the ice cream truck. Before the 4-barreled shotgun. Before Bowie became one of the most quoted lines in cult horror history, there was just Reginald Horace Bannister, born September 29, 1945, in Long Beach, California, now. Here's something a lot of casual horror fans don't know about Reggie. He wasn't some Hollywood kid who grew up dreaming of being a movie star. Music came first. Long before he ever stood in front of a camera, Reggie was a working musician, playing guitar and singing in dive bars up and down the California coast. And it's actually through music that his entire film career began, in a way that sounds almost too perfect to be true, except it is true, and it's one of the great origin stories in independent horror filmmaking. In the early 1970s, an 18-year-old aspiring filmmaker named Don Coscarelli was deep into pre-production on his very first feature film, a drama called Jim, the World's Greatest. Coscarelli and his producing partner Paul Pepperman needed to fill out their cast, and someone suggested they check out a guy performing at a dive bar in Long Beach called the Wooden Keg. That guy was Reggie Bannister, playing a spirited set of guitar and vocals to a crowd that clearly adored him. Coscarelli would later describe watching Reggie perform that night as the moment he knew he had to have him in the film. After the set, the 2 young filmmakers approached him about co-starring in their movie. Reggie's reported response was something along the lines of skepticism mixed with curiosity, a feature film from these kids, but he said yes. That's it. That's the whole origin story. A chance encounter at a dive bar in Long Beach turned a bar musician into one of the defining faces of American horror. Jim, the World's Greatest, came out in 1975, and it marked the first time Reggie Coscarelli and a tall, imposing character actor named Angus Scrimm worked together. None of them had any idea at the time that this small drama was essentially a dress rehearsal for something that would define all of their careers. A year later, in 1976, Coscarelli and Bannister reunited for a comedy drama called Kenny & Co. And then, in 1979, everything changed. If you weren't around for independent horror in the late 70s, it's hard to overstate how strange, how genuinely unclassifiable Phantasm was when it hit theaters. This wasn't a slasher. It wasn't a haunted house movie. It was something closer to a fever dream, a nightmare logic story about a teenage boy named Mike, played by Michael Baldwin, who suspects that the mortician running the local funeral home is not human. That mortician, credited only as the tall man, was played by Angus Scrimm, and he became an instant icon of horror cinema, silver-eyed, 7 feet tall, capable of crushing a man's hand into a fine spray of blood with a single grip. But the story wasn't just Mike's. Alongside him were his older brother Jody, played by Bill Thornbury, and family friend Reggie, a character who notably shared his actor's actual first name. Coscarelli wrote the role specifically with Bannister in mind, and it shows. Reggie wasn't some chiseled action hero, he was an ice cream truck driver, balding, a little overweight. Armed, eventually, with a modified quadruple-barreled sawed-off shotgun that became one of the most recognizable props in horror history. And somehow, that combination, ordinary guy, extraordinary circumstances, became magic. Here's the thing that made Reggie's performance so enduring, and it's something worth sitting with for a second. He wasn't playing a hero in the traditional sense. He was playing a guy who was scared, who was in over his head, who cracked jokes because the alternative was falling apart, and who kept showing up anyway. Fans who met him at horror conventions over the decades would often say the same thing, that in person Reggie carried that exact same energy. Funny, warm, a little self-deprecating, endlessly loyal to the people around him. The character and the man weren't two separate things. They blurred into each other in a way that's genuinely rare in genre filmmaking. Phantasm became a sleeper hit and, over time, a full-blown cult classic. It spawned 4 sequels: Phantasm 2 in 1988, Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead in 1994, Phantasm, Oblivion in 1998, and finally, after nearly 2 decades of fan campaigns, crowdfunding, and sheer stubborn devotion from Coscarelli, Phantasm, Ravager in 2016. Across all 5 films spanning 37 years of production, only 2 actors appeared in every single installment, Angus Scrimm as the Tall Man and Reggie Bannister as Reggie. Angus Scrimm passed away in 2016, shortly before Ravager's release. Which means Reggie carried the emotional weight of that franchise's final chapter almost entirely on his own. Think about that for a moment. 37 years. Most film franchises don't last that long with the same cast attached, let alone an independent horror series made largely outside the studio system. Reggie Bannister didn't just play a role. He aged alongside a character across nearly 4 decades, and audiences aged right along with him. Fans who first saw Phantasm as teenagers in 1979 were watching Ravager as grandparents. Reggie was there for all of it. And it's worth noting, Reggie wasn't dubbed the hardest working man in horror for nothing. Outside the Phantasm series, he built out an enormous filmography across dozens of genre films: Silent Night, Deadly Night 4, Initiation in 1990, Wishmaster in 1997, the horror comedy classic Bubba Ho-Tep in 2002, alongside Bruce Campbell, Cemetery Gates, The Mangler Reborn, The Rage, The Quiet Ones, Bloody Bible Camp, The Obsidian Curse, and dozens more. He wasn't a one-role actor who got lucky. He built an entire second career in independent horror, showing up at conventions, supporting smaller productions, and staying genuinely accessible to fans for over 40 years. Here's where I think the story gets even more interesting, because Reggie Bannister's life outside the Tall Man's shadow was just as full as his career inside it. Before any of the fame, before Phantasm, Reggie served in the United States military during the Vietnam War. And it wasn't a story of a young man eager to fight. By his own account in later interviews, he was drafted despite personally opposing the war. That's an important piece of who Reggie was, a man who didn't necessarily agree with the circumstances he found himself in, but who served anyway, and who carried the physical consequences of that service for the rest of his life. According to his family, Reggie was exposed to Agent Orange during his time in Vietnam, the chemical defoliant the US military used extensively to clear jungle terrain and destroy enemy food supplies. Decades later, exposure to Agent Orange has been linked to a range of serious long-term health conditions. And it's something many Vietnam veterans have continued to grapple with for the rest of their lives. Music remained a constant thread throughout Reggie's life. He never stopped performing. Across the decades, he released numerous albums, blending his love of blues, rock and folk into a body of musical work that ran parallel to his acting career the entire time. If you only know Reggie from the Phantasm films, it's worth seeking out his music. It's a whole other side of who he was, and by all accounts it mattered to him just as much as anything he did on screen. And then there's Gigi. In 1995, Reggie was introduced to a woman named Gigi through a mutual friend, and not just any mutual friend, but horror legend Michael Berryman, known for his unforgettable role in The Hills Have Eyes. Reggie and Gigi hit it off, and the two married in 2001. Gigi wasn't just Reggie's wife, she became his creative partner. She worked on makeup and special effects for the fourth and fifth Phantasm films, meaning she was literally behind the scenes helping craft the world her husband starred in. The two of them also collaborated together on other projects, including the 2012 horror comedy Bloody Bloody Bible Camp, and Gigi frequently performed alongside Reggie musically as well. By every account, theirs was a genuine creative and romantic partnership that lasted a quarter of a century. It's these details, the drafted soldier who opposed the war he fought in, the bar musician who accidentally became a horror icon, the marriage built through a mutual friend at a horror convention circuit, that make Reggie Bannister feel less like a Hollywood biography and more like someone you might actually know. Someone real. Now we have to talk about the harder part of this story, because it's the part that explains why this loss, while devastating, wasn't entirely without warning to those close to him. According to representatives for the family, Reggie was diagnosed with vascular dementia associated with Parkinson's disease back in 2016, the same year Phantasm, Ravager was finally released, closing out the franchise that had defined so much of his life. Think about that timing for a second. The same year he was helping bring a decades-long passion project to its conclusion, he was also quietly beginning to face one of the most difficult diagnoses a person can receive. By February 2024, his condition had progressed further, evolving into Lewy body dementia. For those unfamiliar, Lewy body dementia is a progressive condition that affects thinking, memory, and behavior over time. And it often occurs alongside Parkinson's-related symptoms, tremors, difficulty with balance, and increasing challenges with speech and movement. It's one of the more difficult forms of dementia, both for patients and for the families who care for them, because it affects not just memory, but perception, mood, and motor function all at once. Despite the diagnosis, by all accounts, Reggie continued to stay connected to the world that loved him for as long as he could. He remained part of the horror convention circuit, continued making music, and continued being, as his friends and fans consistently described him, cool, funny, loyal, and steadfast, someone who valued the people around him enormously. In his final period, Reggie was resting at the home he and Gigi kept in the San Bernardino County Mountains in the small community of Crestline, California, a peaceful mountain retreat far from the noise of Hollywood. He had caregivers with him, and Gigi remained by his side throughout. According to a statement from his representative, Reggie fought the debilitating effects of Parkinson's while resting comfortably in that mountain home, with Gigi staying with him until the very end. Reggie Bannister passed away early Sunday morning, August 9, 2026, at that home in Crestline. He was 80 years old. Gigi later shared that he was happy to be home during his final moments and that he died peacefully. There's something quietly meaningful about that detail. A man who spent decades as a beloved figure at loud, crowded horror conventions, surrounded by fans, cameras, and fellow genre icons, ultimately passed away in a quiet mountain cabin, at home with the person he loved most beside him. After a life this public, that's a gentle way to go. News of Reggie's passing began circulating quickly, and it wasn't long before Don Coscarelli, the man who discovered him in that Long Beach dive bar over 50 years ago, and who built an entire cinematic universe around him, shared a deeply personal tribute across his social media. Coscarelli opened by saying, plainly, that he had lost his hero. He went on to describe first meeting Reggie as an 18-year-old filmmaker, recounting that same night at the Wooden Keg, where he watched Reggie perform and knew immediately he wanted him for his first film. He reflected on how, across the Phantasm series, only Reggie could have turned what was written as a simple sidekick role, an ice cream vendor along for the ride, into one of horror's most beloved and unlikely action heroes. Coscarelli's message made clear that this wasn't just professional admiration. He described Reggie as someone who poured himself entirely into that character, someone fans consistently found to be exactly as warm and genuine in person as he appeared on screen. In Coscarelli's words, Reggie the character and Reggie the friend were, in many ways, the same person. He also took time to honor the parts of Reggie's life outside the franchise, his ongoing music career, the albums he continued to release throughout his life, and his creative partnership with Gigi, both on-screen and in music, over the decades they spent together. It's rare to see a filmmaker and an actor maintain a working and personal relationship across 5 decades and 5 films. Coscarelli and Bannister's bond wasn't a Hollywood arrangement. It was a genuine, lifelong friendship that began before either of them had made a real movie, and it lasted until Reggie's final days. The horror community's response matched that same tone. Across social media and horror news outlets, fans and fellow genre figures shared memories of meeting Reggie at conventions over the years, consistently describing him as approachable, funny, and generous with his time in an industry not always known for those qualities. Fellow actors, directors, and longtime fans posted tributes acknowledging not just his on-screen legacy, but his decades of military service and the quiet dignity with which he faced his final years. Many pointed out that Phantasm remains one of the most beloved and unfairly under-the-radar cult franchises in horror history, and that Reggie's performance, equal parts comic relief, wounded everyman, and reluctant action hero was a huge part of why the series endured for as long as it did. Plans have been shared for multiple memorial services to be held for family and close friends, along with a separate public celebration of life for Reggie's fans and fellow musicians. A fitting way to honor a man who spent his entire adult life connecting with people through both music and film. So why does this loss feel so significant, even to people who might not consider themselves die-hard horror fans? I think it comes down to what Reggie represented within the genre. Horror cinema is full of icons, masked killers, monsters, scream queens, final girls fighting for survival against impossible odds. But Reggie Bannister represented something different. He was proof that you didn't need to look like a conventional action star to become one. He was proof that an independent film made on a shoestring budget in the late 70s could create characters so beloved that audiences would follow them across 5 movies and nearly 4 decades. And he was proof that an actor could remain genuinely, consistently kind to the people who loved his work, for his entire life, without ever letting fame change who he fundamentally was. There's also something to be said about longevity here. In an industry that often discards actors the moment they age out of leading man looks, Reggie Bannister kept working in the genre he loved for over 50 years. From that first film with Coscarelli in 1975, all the way through convention appearances well into his final years. He never stopped being Reggie. Not the character, although certainly that too, but Reggie the person. A musician, a veteran, a husband, a friend, and to an entire generation of horror fans, one of the genre's most consistently beloved figures. And there's something almost poetic about the fact that his final years were shaped by the same condition, Parkinson's-related dementia, that so many veterans exposed to Agent Orange have quietly battled for decades, often without the public attention that Reggie's passing has now brought to the issue. His story is, in its own way, also a reminder of the long-term cost that service in Vietnam placed on an entire generation of American veterans, many of whom are only now, decades later, facing the delayed consequences of that exposure. Reggie Bannister leaves behind an enormous body of work, over 50 film and television credits, multiple music albums, and a legacy within the horror community that goes far beyond box office numbers or critical acclaim. He leaves behind his wife Gigi, who stood beside him through his final battle exactly as she had stood beside him professionally for a quarter century. And he leaves behind millions of horror fans who grew up watching a balding ice cream man with a shotgun refuse, again and again, across 5 films and 37 years, to back down from the darkness. There's a line that gets quoted constantly by Phantasm fans. You probably know it if you've seen the films. It's short, it's strange. And somehow it's become one of the most iconic pieces of horror dialogue ever committed to film. And it's fitting, in a strange way, that a character built almost entirely around resilience, around getting knocked down by impossible otherworldly evil and getting back up anyway, was played for nearly 4 decades by a man who, by every account, lived exactly that way in real life. Through a war he didn't choose to fight, through a health battle he faced with dignity, through 50 years in an industry that rarely rewards loyalty with loyalty in return. Reggie Bannister was 80 years old. He is survived by his wife Gigi, by a filmography that will keep introducing new fans to Phantasm for generations to come, and by a music catalogue that deserves just as much attention as his acting work ever got. Rest easy, Reggie. Thank you for the ice cream truck, thank you for the 4-barreled shotgun, and thank you, more than anything, for showing an entire generation of horror fans what it looks like to be an unlikely hero, on screen and off. If this video meant something to you, let us know in the comments which Phantasm film was your first, or share your own memory of meeting Reggie at a convention. And if you want to see more tributes to the horror icons who shaped this genre, make sure you're subscribed, because we're not done honouring the legends.